Animal Liberation has been an extremely influential book. The impact that it has on Stephen Wise is just one example of that. He completely redirected his law practice because of it. In the more than 40 years since the publication of Animal Liberation, there have been some changes in our attitudes and some of our laws and practices with respect to non-human animals. What changes have you found most gratifying, and what do you regret hasn't changed about our practices and attitudes towards the treatment of non-human animals?
There are a lot of changes that I find gratifying. In particular, I think there are different attitudes to animals in many countries, and the interests of animals are taken more seriously. It's to say that animals have rights is no longer to invite ridicule or laughter, as it was back in the 1970s when I first began thinking about this issue. To say that you're a vegetarian is no longer to be thought of as a crank, and to say that you're a vegan is actually understood. Nobody knew what that word even meant 40 years ago. So these are all big changes, and they're reflected in the greater availability of vegan food, in the fact that when you walk into a supermarket, you can find eggs that don't come from hens kept in battery cages. These are all really important differences, and they affect hundreds of millions of animals. In terms of legislative changes, probably the most significant have been the changes in the European Union, which have prevented some of the worst forms of the confinement that I described in Animal Liberation. And again, that has affected hundreds of millions of animals. Also, the state of California passed legislation back in 2008 at a referendum to ban some forms of confinement. So these are really important changes, and I'm pleased to have contributed in some way to them. The things that frustrate me are the fact that there is, factory farming still exists, although it's such an obviously horrible system for animals, as well as being an environmental disaster, and it serves no necessary purpose at all. So I suppose, if the world were a more reasonable kind of place, it simply would have ceased to exist by now. And that, along with a number of other animal abuses, but that's probably the biggest single one, it's frustrating that we can't get rid of them.
Great, thanks. The primary moral thesis of Animal Liberation is that biological species is never an intrinsically significant moral factor in determining the standing of an individual. So because it's human is never by itself a justification for treating an individual differently from other individuals. This thesis obviously has implications for a lot of our moral thinking and practices. One of these implications concerns just the issue of animal suffering and whether it counts at all morally, or more controversially, whether it counts equally with human suffering. But Stephen Wise's work really addresses a different sort of moral standing. He's seeking to get courts to recognize that animals, non-human animals, some non-human animals have standing as legal persons. And I'm wondering what features the capacity to suffer is what you think makes something of moral significance. But what characteristics or features do you think are relevant to having the sort of moral standing that Mr. Wise is seeking for animals in courts?
Well, you're right. I think that the capacity to feel pain, or for that conversely to enjoy life, suffering and pleasure or happiness, they're the absolute bedrock. Once a being has some capacity to feel pain, if we take that as the most basic of those things, then it has some moral significance, and the law ought to recognize that. But if we're talking about animals as moral persons, I suppose one could demand more. One could demand, for example, some capacity to make choices, some capacity to be aware of oneself as a being with a past and with a future. so that one is not living simply in a moment-for-moment way, responding to whatever is immediately in front of one, but is actually able to make choices based on memory and reflection and anticipations of the future. And I think it's clear that not only chimpanzees, but also the other great apes, gorillas, bonobos, orangutans, that they have those capacities. The things that they can do can't really be explained without assuming that they have some capacity for thinking, for reflection, for self-awareness. And I would see those as important for both moral and legal personhood, as distinct from the status of simply being a sentient being.
Great. So historically, the Anglo-American legal system, at least, has tended to divide the world into mere things, which legal persons can argue about, and legal persons that have some legal standing, and to deal with animal treatment issues just in terms of welfare, animal welfare laws. Apart from Stephen Wise's attempt to change that in the U.S. legal system, are you aware of legislative or judicial challenges to the status of non-human animals as mere things?
There have been a number of challenges to the status of non-human animals as mere things, and in fact some of those changes have been implemented, especially in Europe, although none of them go as far as what Steve Wise is seeking to achieve in terms of making animals legal persons. What has happened rather in Europe is that instead of this dichotomy between, on the one hand, being an object, a thing, and on the other hand, being a fully fledged legal person, some European legislators have tried to create an intermediate status, the status of sentient being. And that has happened to a significant extent in Europe. The fundamental treaty of the European Union, known as the Treaty of Lisbon, now recognizes since 2009 that animals are sentient beings, and directs the various agencies of the European Union in making regulations relating to agriculture or transport or a number of other areas that they must take into account that animals are sentient beings. So in that sense, they're not merely things. And some European nations have also enacted their own specific legislation in that regard. Particularly Germany, Austria, and Switzerland have legislation like that. And France more recently passed some legislation, although I think the French legislation applies to companion animals and maybe some other animals, but it certainly doesn't apply to all animals. So these are steps in the right direction, I would say. They're certainly not going far enough. I think that there's no sound reason for not giving all animals the status of something that is clearly not a thing, and arguably is a legal person. If small children are legal persons, although small children are not reasoning or even self-aware beings when they're very young, then it's hard to see why non-human animals should not also have that status.
Let me ask you one more question. You said at the beginning that there was much that you were gratified by over the last 40 years and some things that were still frustrating. Are you hopeful for the future? Is it, when you look at the way in which younger generations look at these issues and what they're concerned about, does it give you hope that we're moving in the right direction in general?
I generally have a reasonably optimistic temperament, and I do think that change has definitely been in the right direction in these areas. I'd have to say I was somewhat more optimistic, especially for the United States, before last November's election. That definitely seems a throwback in the wrong direction, but I'm hoping that that's going to prove an aberration, and that the country will continue to move forward on a range of issues, but including the question of the status of animals.